Testing by batching cases. Last time we talked about Singapore testing dormitory cases, how they're planning on testing everybody in the dormitory. They also have another plan to test those without links. They say they need extensive community surveillance to better detect any unlinked cases. Well, what do they mean by unlinked cases? On the right side, you see two cases, neighbors, A and B, and you can see a relationship between them, how they may have gotten it. But KC is surrounded by a bunch of people that don't have it. How did KC get it? Well, we don't know. We just know that KC has it. How will we find KC? When currently the only methods for finding somebody in Singapore are contact tracing or testing somebody because they had contact with somebody else with coronavirus. Well, Wuhan, they just tested everybody. They found 300 asymptomatic cases in the general population. These people could have transmitted the disease. Other people were worried. They isolated them. But that's an awfully expensive and labor-intensive way of catching it. If you think about the fraction of asymptomatic cases in the population, it's 0.003%. For comparison, let's list some diseases that you may have heard of. Breast cancer, that's pretty common. Females have a 12% chance of getting it in their lifetime. Parkinson's, also relatively common, over the age of 60. It's only 1% though. Huntington's disease is relatively rare. You may have heard of people going crazy when they're younger, the CAG DNA repeats that cause it to start younger and younger, or the weird dancing movements they have called Huntington's chorea. That's 0.005%, which actually is more common than finding somebody in Wuhan with an asymptomatic coronavirus. And there's something rare called acromegaly. I don't know if you've seen it before. It's really quite rare. It's not the same as gigantism, which is just when somebody's big, because there's many reasons somebody could be really big. This is a tumor making it so you secrete too much growth hormone and you have deformed growth. It's so uncommon you likely haven't heard of it, you haven't seen it, and is less common than finding somebody with the coronavirus in Wuhan. If you look at it, finding somebody in Wuhan with the coronavirus is very, very, very hard. It seems like you're fishing for a needle in a haystack. You have to go through every single part of that haystack to find the needles. In most other countries, it is more common though. Let's go back to Singapore where they're talking about unlinked cases. The strategy is actually very well established to try to find these cases. Because we do this all the time, it's something called screening. Many diseases have no linkages. We don't know enough about genetics, or we just don't see a genetic component. So we just have to look for people who have disease anyway. Colonoscopy is one form of screening. You put a camera inside, you see if there's any polyps in the colon. These abnormal growths may be precancerous. And you figure it out by testing somebody, by screening somebody. There's actually a government agency in the US called the Preventive Services Task Force, and this is actually one big part of their job. Screening, as you can see, there's lots and lots of places it pops up. If you go through the page, they have recommendations for screening. And screening is like trying to find somebody who has the coronavirus but is asymptomatic. The idea of screening is figuring out somebody has a cancer or a disease before they actually show symptoms. Let's zoom in on one recommendation, breast cancer, women aged 50 to 74. The agency recommends biannual, meaning once every 2 years, mammogram. They put a grade of B. What does that mean? A is obviously the best grade to have. Wholehearted recommendation, very certain it's beneficial. B means it's still recommended. There's only moderate certainty though that it's beneficial. C means not really sure. D means actually not recommended. And I means insufficient evidence. So how does this apply looking for unlinked cases of the coronavirus? Let's look at a few different scenarios. For each of those scenarios, think to yourself, what grade of recommendation would you give for screening this one individual? This is the first one, Christopher Knight. He made the news because he finally came out of the woods 27 years later after he went in. That's a very long time. What would be the benefit of screening him? What would the recommendation be? What about Natalie Suleiman, better known as Octomom, for when she gave birth to octuplets? They're still all alive. In total, she has 14 kids now. What would the recommendation be for screening her for coronavirus? And this old Japanese couple, they're very cute, right? On Instagram, they're very popular for their matching outfits. They go out and enjoy life. What grade would you give them for screening? And Arthur. It's a movie about a spoiled son, happens to be heir of a large fortune. He interacts with everybody, he goes on parties every night basically. What grade of a recommendation would you give for screening him? For the man who's a hermit, the screening recommendation would actually be a grade of D. He's asymptomatic. There's no reason to bother him. He doesn't interact with anybody. He cannot transmit it. Don't test him. It does more harm than good. For Octomom, it would be an A. She has 14 kids. You better screen her. She could pass it on to a kid. They could pass it on to, well, there's 14 of them. They could pass it on to basically anybody. For the QO couple, I would actually say a B. They're mostly by themselves. They do go out, so there's some risk there, but you don't have to worry about them giving it to each other. If it would have happened, it would have happened. If it hasn't happened, doesn't seem like it's going to happen. And Arthur? Yes, A. He definitely needs it. He runs around in the streets, he throws his money around, he approaches random strangers, he's just very high risk. And after we decided we do want to screen people, we realized we don't actually have enough test kits available. Even after we exclude people like Christopher Knight the Hermit, we still don't have enough. Now what do? Well, there's a strategy called sample pooling or batching. What happens after you get a swab for coronavirus? You transfer it to a reagent in a test tube, a mixture that will actually be the thing sent to the lab. And in the lab, they transfer it to another machine called a PCR machine. This is the one actually running the test. But what if, instead of putting in one swab to one test tube, you put in 3 swabs to one test tube? Then instead of running 1 test at a time on the PCR machine, you run 3 tests at a time. If you do 10 swabs in one, you run 10 tests at a time. It's 10 times as fast. Remember, resources are limited. This simple little machine costs $5,000 to $7,000. It can run 96 tubes at once. If you want to run 10,000 tests, it may take you a while. And there's better machines. Maybe this is what they used in China to run these millions of tests. This machine could handle a lot more. It says 12,000 data points at one time. It also costs over $90,000. So let's look at the setup. You group people or batch them. Persons 1, 2, 3 get put in test group A. They go in the first slot on the PCR machine. Persons 4, 5, 6 get test group B. They go in the second slot on the PCR machine, and so on. So you have a total of 4 tests running in the PCR machine. And if all the results come back negative, then you have effectively tested 12 people using only 4 slots in the machine. If one result comes back positive, then you need to retest everybody individually. So you have to add 3 tests. You end up doing 7 tests instead of 4. So you still come out ahead. And with 2 positive, you still end up doing 4 plus 3 plus 3 or 10 tests. And you're still a little bit positive, as that's less than doing the 12 straight off. However, 2 positives out of 12 people is 17% prevalence, a much higher rate than anybody would expect. In fact, even 1 positive out of 12 is a much higher rate than anybody would expect. And that's what Wuhan did, batch testing. They have such a low prevalence of disease, that is, how many people have disease in the population, that they could batch and get through testing a whole lot faster. From May 14th to June 1st, 2 weeks and 4 days, they tested 10 million cases. 550 tests per day if there were no batching. This is from the COVID tracking project. The US as a whole, all the states and the territories, have not even reached that amount of testing, 550,000 tests a day. Wuhan is just one city in China, but they didn't actually do that many tests, they just batched them. And I think that's a very good strategy. Maybe it's something not ready for the US, as it still has too many cases, but someplace like Singapore, where they have much fewer cases in the community, will try to do. They'll probably use this strategy to try to find the unlinked cases, the asymptomatic cases which may still be spreading the virus, and batch testing is one way of accomplishing that.